A marriage that really is good is not one without conflict. The strength of entering into brokenness is not discouragement, but actually the freedom to be able to say, our living God really does restore broken people.
Hello, and welcome to Working with me, Dan Doriani, hosting a podcast where we explore faith, work, culture, and the way believers can make a difference in their corner of the world. Good day. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Working with Dan Doriani. I'm so glad to have Dan Allender as my guest today. I had him a couple of years ago. We had a delightful time. We've known each other, not in the same place a lot, but we've known each other for 20 years and had a number of good conversations. So in case you don't know, Dan Allender is a therapist, an author, a professor whose work especially focuses on trauma, abuse, and trauma recovery. And he does that in his private practice by counseling people, by writing books, by giving public lectures, and by teaching formally in schools that are accredited for that purpose. He's got a PhD in counseling psychology from Michigan State. He's written a bunch of books that many, many people have read. I've certainly profited from Wounded Heart and To Be Told. Those both meant a lot to me as I worked on some issues. Multiple books on marriage. The most recent one is what we'll talk about especially today, and that is Deep-Rooted Marriage, which he wrote with his friend and colleague, Steve Call. I got to tell you, it's a good book. All your books are stimulating. All your books are fun. I wanted to throw it across the room once or twice. What do you have to say about that? First of all, did I introduce you properly? And then what do you think when somebody says, I read your book, I loved it, I marked it up, and I threw it across the room?
Dan, being with you is a great honor. And then to actually be propelled through the air by your good hand and by your good heart, I am very honored. So I said to you, I would have thrown my own book, but it was in a computer, and in that sense, it was too valuable to throw. But I think anything that gives us a chance to intersect between the idea that we're deeply broken and deeply beautiful disturbs us on both counts. So I'm honored.
Yeah, that's good. There's a teaching in the book of Romans, chapters 9, 10, 11, which say that the Jews got angry. You're Jewish, I'm half Jewish, you're more than half Jewish. But the Jews became angry that the Gentiles were owning the covenant, coming to the covenant. It's like, that somebody's really listening when they get angry. I got angry at your book is one of the highest compliments I think you can pay, is that I couldn't dismiss it. I couldn't just put it aside. I had to throw it away because it was getting under my skin too much. So your books have that effect on people. And I think that's a compliment. How do you make sense of that people love your work and yet they find it, boy, it's like some worm that got into your foot and traveled up your blood vessels and got into your heart?
Well, I think two things. One is I love the education I got at Westminster Theological Seminary, and particularly the day I went. Men who love Jesus so deeply and yet were so honest about their own brokenness and their own need for grace. It was such a world to begin to tell the truth about the nature of my own humanity. And there, as you know, there's a lot of flaws, past, present, and no doubt future. So that would be one. I think the other is, and we'll get into this to some degree, my way of surviving a mom who was, if we use the technical term, borderline personality disorder. People don't know that.
And no dad, just to make it clear, you lost your father when you were very young.
Yeah, about age 4, but my mom remarried a man who couldn't have been kinder, but literally, and I say this literally, seldom spoke a full sentence. He was a monosyllabic man. So between a really kind face, but absent at levels that are almost incomprehensible, I was in the web of a relationship where I was the life-giving source, in some ways, the proverbial husband to my own mother as a 4, 5, 6-year-old. At least I have memory. My one saving grace was when I caused trouble, meaning if I got sent to the principal as a young boy onto junior high, if later I got caught stealing a car, if I got caught selling drugs, if I got caught in trouble, it was the one spot where maybe for 2 to 4 days, my mother wouldn't speak to me. And that...
Which was life-giving for you.
Oh, it was like being sent to the Bahamas for a resort trip. So what I learned was...
But we can't draw this out, because she was very, very critical, because she was harsh, because she was... Tell us. Well, I mean, I read the book, but most of our people haven't read the book. Why did you need 3 days respite and engage in criminal activity to get a break?
Well, I remember telling my best friend, Tremper Longman, when we were about 15 years of age, that my mother was like a black widow spider, and I'm in her web. And if I move too much, she is going to come and devour me. So I think a lot of us either had very critical or very disconnected, or in my case, very absorptive parents who, in her need to devour, use me as the source of her life. Well, the only way to cut myself out of the web was to cause trouble. So in some ways, causing trouble, and again, I'm not claiming this is the nature of what a good prophet is, but in certain ways, those who, in one sense, aren't afraid of creating waves, oftentimes are able to say things that outsiders, people who are not quite in the world that good-hearted, good bound folks tend to do. So in some ways, I think you can see how that plays out in my book and my writing, my teaching, but it also plays out in the marriage. And that is the realm of looking at, oh my gosh, we can be in a fight and it's not going to be pretty. I'm verbal, I'm bright, but I can be absolutely obstinate and defiant. That creates a lot of heartache and debris in a marriage.
Well, as always, there's so many things I want to ask you all at once. First, I'll just comment to make it clear that one thing you and I bond over is that I grew up in a very difficult home, not the same way yours was. My mother was very, very kind, very loving, very nurturing, very disorderly. And my father was verbally extraordinarily brutal and also prone to violence at times. So we have similarities. And your interest in this book, I think, is partly to make sure we face our past and don't just say, hey, that's the past, let's move on. And also to make sure people know that whatever happened in the past, if I understood you correctly, shaped the way we make our success or our way through the world with less pain. So when I would go home as an adult with my wife, she would say, you change when you enter your parents' house. You behave differently starting the minute, maybe not the minute, maybe 5 minutes after you walk in, you simply start to check out. You start reading something and you're over in a corner, and whatever happens, it's like you don't even hear it. What's going on? And she said, I hear it, she said. And I said, well, I was the invisible child. I didn't try to help my mom. I didn't try to help my dad. They didn't want my help. I was the invisible one. And it's so easy to fall back into being invisible. You would say that it's not only interesting that I realized I did that when I was 31, but I do that in some ways at home, or somehow or other in my marriage. I'm going to bring that survival mechanism, and it's going to cause trouble, even if I don't know it or acknowledge it. Does that sound right?
Brilliant. I love it. You should have written the book, but
no, I should have enjoyed the book. Go ahead.
Well, the bottom line is we literally are being shaped in a way of thinking, a way of being. Our very personalities are being shaped, particularly between that, 1 and 2 to about 4 and 5. I mean, literally, we have over 1 trillion cells in operation between 2 and 5. There is what's called neuropruning. By the time we get about 5, 6, and 7, we're down to just about 3 or 4 billion. But 1 trillion cells are shaping
in the brain, that is.
Surviving in the brain.
Yeah.
So when we begin to get a sense that those early learning classrooms are shaping core implicit structures of how we operate in the world. But I love the reality that there is neuroplasticity, meaning our brains, our cells, our connections, synapses can change. And that is the core reality of how we approach if we have the integrity to name what's true. You cannot change what you have not named. And in that kind of I would say the same for me. Becky would often say to me, you're not allowed to take a book into your own parents' home because I know what you will do. Instead of causing trouble, you will dissociate and leave me to tend to your silent father and your crazy mother. And I just don't want to do it. That's why we begin Genesis 2:24 talking about leave your mother and father. That's not physical, not in the ancient Near East. It's not financial, not in the
doesn't mean you
ancient
move
Near
to
East.
another state. It means you emotionally separate.
Yeah,
Right.
loyalty. So structures, we're not just loyal to people, we're loyal to structures that enabled us to survive. So what your wife is calling us to is to repentance, a kind of, I do not want to see you become 4 or 8 or 10 years of age. I want you to be the man that you are, even in the context of really what for most of us, even if we won't admit it, is one of the most dangerous environments to be in, and that is with people we still long for the blessing of, even if they're not on the earth. So this whole notion of a deep-rooted marriage has to actually be faithful to leaving our mothers and fathers. But to do that, we have to name the heartache and the structure of how loyalty got played out in the synapses in our brain in a way that has to be engaged today.
So let me, I'm going to offer a point and then a thought, and then you can respond to it, if you will. I'll maybe even offer 2 thoughts, and you decide what you want to do. So first of all, just for our listeners, there are trillions of cells in the human body. There are billions of cells in the human brain, but the billions of cells many of them have innumerable connections through the synapses. So what Dan is saying, what Dan Allender is saying is physiologically correct. It's not exaggeration. It's not figure of speech. People believe that there are more connections in the human brain than there are stars in the universe. At least, for sure, far, far, far more than stars in the Milky Way, maybe more than stars in the universe, because nobody really knows how many stars are in the universe. So we understand this is a literal statement about plasticity of the brain and winnowing the brain and reshaping the brain. The cells go down, the connections go up, and that's how we can relearn things at a physical level. Then there are 2 directions I want to go, and I'll let you choose. On the one hand, I'll say for somebody like my wife, who grew up in a truly blissful home, love, care, order, never any doubt about food and clothing, no cruelty, no meanness, really close to an ideal home. It reminds me actually of when I dropped my 3rd child off at college, and one last talk before we leave. And I said, I have one concern about you and one only as I drop you off in college, and that is that nothing bad has ever happened to you. And that wasn't true of your sisters. They both went through things, not terrible things, but things. And she didn't disagree. She said, it's true. I never have had anything really bad. So people who've had, by now she has had bad things. Everybody does eventually. But people who have a blissful life have a hard time understanding a spouse or a friend who comes from a much more difficult background. In other words, when I said to my wife, you need to read this book, meaning Deep-Rooted Marriage, because it'll help us understand each other in our marriage. She kind of said, I don't get it. I'm not resonating with this book. I don't have traumas. So what would you say to the person? And then other people say, you know what, it's a good point about becoming a different person when I go home. And our spouse wants us to be our whole self. And we say, it's too painful. I think I'll never go home again. Or not for 5 years. So pick up whatever you want out of those threads.
Well, this is where, again, I don't want to challenge your wife because I know she is a remarkable human being. The but comes, but what I'd have to say is, do you believe your mom and dad are sinners? And I know she's theologically sophisticated. She's
Enough
gonna
to
have
say,
this man,
yes, right. Sure.
If I were to say, John sort of covered that by saying, if we do not sin, we are liars. Okay. So tell me quickly, what's the nature of sin? And I might remind her that it's good to begin with Matthew 5. Mom and Dad, they struggled with lust, didn't they? No, they didn't. Oh, so they're not sinners. Okay. But they were angry, right? No. Oh, no, they're not sinners. So the very nature of sin requires you to face that all of us have an ache for what only eternity can provide, and that we are at some level looking for something, someone to fill it. That's lust, desire gone mad. So if there was absolute purity of desire in both her mom and dad, I'd go, wow, then they weren't sinners. How do they make you pay? And that's when we don't get what we crave, demand, we're going to make someone pay. And it might be us. We may make ourselves pay, but we're going to make someone pay. Now, this is where you go. If Allender is saying it, of course it's hyperbole. But Jesus kind of goes, you think lust is a problem? It's really adultery. You think anger is an issue? Murder. So she grew up with 2 adulterers and murderers. Now, here's my point. The better your family, the keener your sense of how harm shows itself in your own life, not the opposite. So the bottom line is, somebody who's had just crystal clear blue skies where you can see the proverbial 12, 13 miles ought to be able to see, even in the small moments, how deeply far we are all from what we were meant to be in terms of being fully like Jesus. When you see him, then you will be as he is. What I'm getting to is this one phrase: the more subtle, the more satanic. So I do know a handful of people in my world who had really, really, really good mothers and fathers. I don't question that can happen. Mm-hmm. Here's the but. But because they had such good moms and dads, entering the subtlety of their own parents' sin feels like it's too dangerous and too almost like I'm making such a big deal out of something so small. Well, the so small would have brought Jesus to the cross. Nonetheless, it's hard with a good background to actually enter into every world east of Eden brings something of the heartache, but also the longing for what heaven will be.
Yeah, so if you have, I would say, if you have an almost perfect dad, let's say, there's a really good chance that dad was maybe overly concerned with being a perfect dad, or loved kids so much and maybe neglected mom a little bit and played little games of disequilibrium on what relationship is most important. Doesn't mean he wasn't a great dad overall. And my kids hit me pretty hard. I mean, they think I'm a good guy overall, but they hit me pretty hard on overwork, which is idolatry.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, are we all, to some degree, aware that, again, failure is part of the nature of life, and the ability to even be able to name to a child, I'm angry. I don't know if you can see it or feel it, but right now I'm angry. Again, if your wife's mom or dad didn't confess their own lust or anger, that alone is a failure of love, because our children need to have data, because we know, research indicates by age 4, this is amazing. Children know when a parent is not telling the whole truth or not telling the truth at all. So we socialize children mostly to not be able to name what's true. But apparently your adult children, or my guess would be your children when they were younger, had the freedom to be able to know, my dad is a good man, but he also struggles with lust and anger. Therefore, the freedom to be able to name what's true. You are broken, but you are stunningly beautiful.
Yeah. So this is amazing because I have a 4-year-old granddaughter is a delight to hang out with right now. And in the realm of truth telling, she leaned over to me in the most conspiratorial tone and posture that any adult has ever pulled off. So you know how people lean in when they're going to tell you a secret that they're not sure they should tell you? She leaned in and said, I was sitting on the sofa with her. She said, Papa, we watch you on TV sometimes. And of course, she was confessing that they didn't go to church.
Exactly.
There was something. She knew that she shouldn't shout. We didn't go to church. We went to sofa church and watched you on TV. I mean, she was like 4 years and 2 months old, and she knew. Her body said, I know about truth telling, and some things are true, but you don't talk about them openly.
Yes. Yes. So all we'll do is
hey, can I go? Let me pick you up on. I want to go to something particular here. So
sure.
Truth telling connect to trauma. So when I read your book about trauma, the first time I encountered your work, I thought, trauma. I hate that word. I hate the word abuse. The way I negotiated my childhood, finally, as I think I told you at one point, was I couldn't bear to apply the word abuse to what happened in my home. So I called it warfare. Children at war. My older brother and I were at war with my father all the time, and sometimes with my mother. Even when we were having fun, there was a sort of an angular, jockeying, powered something going on. So we were constantly at war. It wasn't abuse, all right? So then I read your book, Trauma, Face Your Abuse, et cetera, which I hated, but I needed. The analogy I use is the study of football players, and I know you played football, and I played football enough to know about blows to the body. And concussions are one thing, but the micro concussions, that's the real deal. It doesn't matter how many times you had formally entered into concussion protocol. What matters is how many times your brain jostled around in a way that's not healthy for you. That's small t trauma. And if small c concussions are what do the real damage to a football player's brain, which is what the science seems to indicate, then it's the small t traumas that we all need to address, even if you never had a capital T trauma, mom saying, I'm leaving you, I'm out of here, et cetera.
Oh, totally right. And part of that is to look at where you get triggered. Triggers are not just an indication of trauma, it's an indication of how we defend ourselves. Like Becky and I had a moment a couple weeks ago where we got into a nasty interaction over whether a baked potato was actually done or not. And I'm like, this is 48 years of marriage, and we're standing in front of the oven, the baked potato's out, we're going to cut it in half, and it's not done. It's not done. And she says, it's done. Well, it escalated into the particularity of language I won't actually take us into, other than to say minutes of interaction, not just over an evaluation of a baked potato, but over each of our characters, over past flights, over the fact that I'm making too big of a deal. She's making too, again, we'll just say it didn't go well. Trigger. Why would a baked potato?
Why did a baked potato do? Or picking apart you parked in the wrong space. How can that possibly escalate? Okay, what's the answer?
Well, for us, if we begin to put the kitchen for me was a war zone. I mean, Swanson dinners were the absolute best meal we'd ever have, because my mom was horrid and hated cooking, resented what it required of her. So meals were horrible. Becky, the kitchen is the only context where her hypercritical and at times cruel mother would show any degree of regard or care through giving food. So for both of us, it's a war zone, just as you put it. It's a war zone. Now, would people say, oh, you were abused? I don't think eating a Swanson dinner constitutes abuse. But nonetheless, it's where we both feel very, very vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Now, the baked potato is, I'm challenging her capacity to feed me and to be a good cook.
Which is, it's the way she loves you.
That's the way she knows love. And again, I have to say that she knows 1,000 other ways because
but at that moment, I love through food, and you're not letting me love you through food.
Exactly. And you're challenging me, basically saying, I'm not competent. And I'm saying, you're not listening to me, just like my mother. You are giving me food that sucks, just like my mother. And so, thank goodness, we've done enough work to have caught the fact that this 2 plus 2 equals 4. No, not in this context. It's 2 plus 2 equals 10.
No, it equals 2 plus 2 equals bananas plus gorillas.
What's the sex that's going on here? And then for us to be able to pause, and Becky said it first, and she just said, can we leave the baked potato? Can we actually leave the kitchen? You go for a little walk. I'll go for a walk. Let's meet back in about 5 minutes. We can reheat the baked potato.
I've read that the amygdala fires, during these interactions, and it takes 15 or 20 minutes. You guys have brought it down to 5. That's good.
Yeah. Yes. And that's really true because we have a sense of when we're being triggered and know that there is more than just unreasonableness. There's something more going on. So 5 minutes for each of us, we're able to come back and start laughing. Like some of the things that Becky said were brilliantly hilarious. So we're laughing now, but still have to eat. And she's like, well, here's a very simple solution. My half is done. You do with your half whatever you need to. But we're able to resolve only because we have the capacity with more compassion to be curious about what's getting triggered in the other. When you've got interplay of a sense of heartache for the other, but also understanding context, it changes the dynamic of conflict. It doesn't resolve it. It gives you a ground to be able to engage one another in a very different way.
That's terrific. So one reason why I had, just to help people appropriate this, and I'll let you comment, one reason why I wanted to have my wife read the book is because I am ordinarily very thick-skinned. And, if you don't like my sermon, my lecture, my whatever it is, you don't like my hair, you don't like my teeth, whatever it is you don't like, I don't really mind all that much. Like, I know it's a matter of taste. Yes, I was out there doing my best. You don't like it, fine. I'm flawed. I don't expect you. But when my wife gives me an irrational or unfounded criticism, that taps into my father, who was ceaseless in irrational, unfounded criticism. So it's not criticism that bothers me. It's irrational from somebody that should be fair and loving. That's why I wanted to read the book, so we can talk about that very issue.
Well, and again, because we have the privilege of talking about your wife, but you engage her well, my comment to her would be, you know something of the wildness of this good man's heart. You know probably more than anyone, except perhaps your children, how tender you really are. But tenderness in the face of deep hatred, not just criticism. In some ways, your father hated you and took joy, hear the phrase, took joy in humiliating you. So in that, there has to be a deep, deep reserve, a watchfulness, and a kind of almost implacable, you will not get to me. I will not let you have the pleasure of getting to me because I know you want to. So your dismissiveness is brilliant. And yet you're a very tender man from other interactions. In that, no wonder you are in some ways spellbinding to the world around you because you have the ferocity and yet the tenderness, yet the vulnerability to be able to name all that's happening in one interaction with your wife. That's why she loves you.
You're being way too kind to me. I'm worse than you think. Let me make that very clear. But no, I think you're absolutely right. What we try to do is protect ourselves. And I declare, in a sense, I say, look, to a lot of the world, you don't know me well enough to criticize me enough to hurt me. But if somebody knows me well enough, that's a different matter.
Yeah. Well, and again, what I'm saying underlying that is that quality of dismissiveness, it is not your truest heart. You are troubled by people who don't like your hair. but not in the way in which, like, you depend upon the gravitas of a compliment as being something that nourishes deep parts of your soul.
So you're making me uncomfortable again. It's like you do this all the time. It's so
but
wonderful.
again, that's why I'm very fond of you, because of your integrity. You are a mess, and you are beautiful. Now, in engaging most of the people I work with, it's such a hard thing for believers. I don't know why. I mean, this is where I feel still like an outsider to Christianity. Why can't we tell the truth? No, wait a minute. I'm a killer, aren't you? I'm an adulterer, aren't you? And I think, honestly, for most people, it's like, no. Jesus,
I'm not that bad. No,
Jesus
I'm not
is
that bad.
just
Leave me
making a
alone.
point about some people. Well, the reality of what's happening in a marriage. Look, as I've said publicly many times, I have never known the kind of love that I believe will be eternal for me in heaven, like I have known through Becky. But I'd also say, not the baked potato is less, but there have been moments of heartache, loneliness, shame in the interplay with her, where I would say, I've tasted something of what I will never have to taste for eternity, and that's hell. So a marriage that really is good, it is not one without conflict. It's where conflicts have the potentiality to expose us and invite us, expose past and present, expose something of the nature of our heart, but also invite us not just to change like you change, but invite us to a love that, again, there is no condemnation. There is no division. That's the kind of love that brings a marriage to a point of going, you are the face of God on my behalf.
Mm-hmm. So that connects to one of your points that I thought was very important on the last half of the book somewhere. I didn't write the page down, but you say that 70%, I think you're quoting John Gottman here, 70% of all conflicts are irresolvable, which the second I read that, I thought that sounds exactly right. By which we don't mean that we can't work our way through it. We mean you like hip hop and Motown, and I detest hip hop and Motown. You like murder mysteries. I hate murder mysteries. You like science fiction. I hate science fiction. You like rom-coms. I like thrillers. I mean, can we agree on anything in the world of entertainment? And the answer is, it's actually kind of fine to say, we disagree a lot about music and a lot about what a good day is, what a good vacation day is, and so forth. And we still love each other. And it's not merely a matter of compromise and meeting in the middle, like play hip hop half the time and play, jazzy improvisation half the time. It's different. It's not compromise. It's not 50-50. It's something else. It's more like, yeah, we totally disagree. And I think it's funny or strange that you like murder mysteries as a calm, placid woman, and that somehow you like that. But I can respect it, and tell me about your book and so forth. Tell me how you would counsel people who think, what on earth, Dan Allender, how can you approve of the idea, and for that matter, Dan Doriani, how can you approve of the idea that 70% of all conflicts are irresolvable? What?
Well, go back to what the other 70% says. The 70% of the issues we fight over: sex, money, in-laws or family, and the context of children. Should we discipline in this moment? Should we offer more grace in this? There's hardly anything that matters that does not involve some degree of difference between you and your spouse.
Right.
Most of the time, you have an angry or angrier person who sets the agenda by a certain degree of intimidation. Oftentimes, you have a quieter, more complacent, compliant person who doesn't truly agree with you, but would prefer to avoid conflict. Often, that gets labeled as, the man's supposed to be the leader. The woman's supposed to be submissive. All I want to say to all that is just to come back to a core issue. We differ on almost everything. Seldom is desire equal in anything. Can we engage that with honor, curiosity, and understanding of how desire gets shaped in each of our bodies and our lives, so that instead of it being something we judge, something that we honor, curious, even if it challenges us, it leaves us with a sense that I couldn't live with you without the differences that make us whole. So, brilliant point. Not compromise, but a creativity that comes because we don't hold one another or ourselves with contempt. Back to that phrase. Contempt is the number
killer.
one killer.
Yeah, right. Disagreement is one thing, contempt is another. So let me just flesh this out for our listeners, see if we're aligned on this. So let's say two parents are both totally committed to love, justice, mercy, faithfulness with their children. And they even have a generally similar view about the line where discipline and mercy falls. That is to say, the child's tired, let it go. When it's a 3-year-old or something, or no, this child is 11 and this is becoming a pattern. We got to address it. And the other parent thinks, is it really a pattern? I don't know if I see a pattern yet. So no matter how close we are, one is occasionally going to be quicker to discipline, the justice side, and the others be occasionally a little quicker toward merciful, overlooking flaws. And if we're not careful, we can read that minor disagreement and let it get bigger and bigger and bigger and end up in conflict that we're not resolving properly by saying, look, we both have a perspective and we disagree sometimes about how we apply it. We could say the same thing about sex or money or how you spend a vacation day. No matter how close you are, you're always going to have disagreements. And you have to understand the best way to address those disagreements with love, respect, and dialogue. Yes?
Amen. Yeah. I mean, for me, justice was so crucial because I needed boundaries with a boundaryless mother. On the other hand, Becky craved touch and kindness, some of the attributes of mercy. And so what drew us together was I was strong and attentive in ways she had never encountered before. And I felt her delight and honor, and yet she, from a cruel mother, needed no one. She was not ever going to be weak. So we were a perfect couple. I'm strong. I'm verbal. She is kind, but also deeply independent. But this is the problem until people start maturing a little bit in Christ. Then all of a sudden the patterns begin to disrupt. And the very things that drew you together often are the very things that, again, begin to repulse you. Mm-hmm. So
can you explain that a little bit? Because I thought that was one of the most important points. I actually wanted to make sure we talked about that. The traits that draw you to your spouse repel you. How can that work, Mr. Counselor, therapist?
Again, the fact that my wife was highly, highly engaged, quiet. I'm a storyteller. I can talk forever because that's how I made my family work. As an only child, I was the one who kept the two of them together and somewhat sane by talking. So Becky loved it, loved hearing my stories, loved hearing me talk. But eventually, you kind of go, I want to get a word in edgewise. When she did, it was disruptive for both of us.
Oh, you had to stop talking.
Yeah, just shut up. So on the other hand, I needed her to be very much in control of her internal life. And she was. But the more I loved her, here's the craziness. The more I loved her, the more she felt safe to begin to ask of me for a level of connection, a level of love that terrified me because it felt very absorptive. So crazy as it may sound, the things that drew us, her certain invulnerability and her quiet, eventually came to a point of, ooh, this doesn't feel good. Bottom line, we look to one another for redemption. And when we don't find redemption through what we thought we were going to gain, we begin to get angry.
And that's how marriage becomes an idol. You know, a lot of the criticism of certain approaches to marriage are that it seeks everything in a spouse. You should be able to talk about everything, enjoy everything. What nonsense is that? That's asking them to be essentially almost godlike in their interests. But your book answered a question that has bothered me for years and years. And that is, why do people keep asking me and my wife, how did you two meet? That's the most banal question imaginable. We were standing on a sidewalk and we bumped into each other. It has nothing to do with anything. But I think what they're trying to ask is, why did you two connect? And that's a question worth asking. And I'll say for us, her family is so safe and so proper and so organized that I seemed a little bit dangerous. And she was probably looking for a little bit of danger. At the time, you know, my hair was, on my shoulders, and I was intellectual, but kind of wearing clothes that probably came out of a used clothing bin somewhere. Some of them did, actually. And so he's safe, he's a Christian, but he's also dangerous. And I was looking, whether I knew it or not, of course, for someone whose life was put together so much more than my disorderly home, which had a lot of love and fun conversations, was just so chaotic. And you just looked at her and her hair was in the right place and the clothes were chosen carefully. And looking back, your book helped me see this, actually. Looking back, that alone attracted me to her, even if I had no awareness of it whatsoever.
Well, and again, if I were in a conversation with your wife, I would go, so you saw in Dan a danger that alleviated something of the monotony and boredom of perfection. Perfection in anyone other than God is not only tedious, but idolatrous.
Yeah. So you buy the idea that we don't know that we're looking for ABC. You promote the idea that we don't know, but we sense it. We know so many things, we don't know why or how we know them, but we know them. And we know that this person is going to do something for us that we have never received, can't imagine getting except through some outsider, which is what you mean by redemption. Not seeking, people don't consciously seek eternal salvation through a spouse, but you seek the healing that none but the Lord can give.
Right. And if we understand, as you do, that redemption isn't just eternal and not just in heaven, but the sense of all things being restored, that there is that element to which we actually are seeking redemption, not the forgiveness of sins, not in one sense the restoration of relationship with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but we are looking for something of what Eden and something of what the new heavens and earth hold for all of us. And that is shalom.
Yeah. And that connects to the last 2 points I want to talk to you about from your book. One, I think it's from Steve Call's chapter, one of his chapters, but I'm sure you agree with it. The I don't know how to pronounce it, but kintsugi, the Japanese art of putting supreme value on a vase or a piece of art that's been broken and restored and trying to make that beautiful. And it connects to something a pastor of mine once said. And to be honest, one of my daughters was most cruelly abandoned by her first husband, autonomously, without reason, which he was very open about. There's no reason. I just don't want to be married anymore. Goodbye. And he told her that. He told me that to my face at length. It's not her fault. I just want to leave. And then she got remarried to a wonderful man who's the father of her children. And I couldn't figure out what to say at their second wedding. She invited me. She asked me to officiate at her wedding, as she did her first wedding. And I was stuck. And I talked to a pastor friend of mine. And he said, second marriages can be the most beautiful of all. It can be a second marriage after the death, maybe at an early age, of a spouse, or after a tragic divorce. And to see God bringing somebody back to healing, back to health. It's in many, to him, he said, most of my favorite weddings were actually second weddings. And it reminded me of kintsugi. And it reminds me of everything you're saying, that we're seeking either a return to the pre-fallen condition in Eden, or more realistically to I call it supra-Edenic. That is to say, it's Eden, but better than Eden ever was, right? The restoration of all things, where we know how things went wrong and how much we've been saved from when all things are set to right again. So that's, I think, a vision of marriage that we share. But expatiate. You're the expert. Say more.
Well, again, our audience can't see it, but I can show you. Right there is a Kintsugi bowl. So it is a bowl that was shattered, not purposefully, but then it's held together, the broken parts, by gold. And so gold, in that sense, not just in terms of, the notion of glory is kavod. And it is, my good friend Tremper would say, kavod holds the idea of something that is thick and strong, but also sparkles with luminescence. It's beautiful, but also ferociously strong. That's the core reality of when we own our brokenness, past, present, when we have the humility to be able to say, how I handle the baked potato, I'm so sad, and I need to tend to how, and even more so, how the kitchen has been a war zone for us. And again, we can't, quote unquote, resolve this, snap our fingers and get out of it, but we can begin to tend to it, talk about it, pray about it, be more and more sensitive to what a bad meal can be addressed. Well, all that comes back to the strength of entering into brokenness is not discouragement, but actually the freedom to be able to say, our living God really does restore broken people. And we are broken, our marriage is broken, and it is stronger than it's ever been. So 48 years of marriage at this point. And again, the book really helped us. That's a crazy thing about being a writer or teacher. Like focusing on what I know to be true, I'm much more aware. She's more aware. And in that, much more free. So when you begin to play out the promise of the coming kingdom, you begin to borrow from the future into the present in a way in which it isn't as laborious. It isn't as difficult. There are tears and still the hunger for redemption in the final sense of being fully who I'm meant to be. Nonetheless, what I would say is I pray for us that we will have many more years. One of the big changes over the last year is Becky began to say, you anticipate dying first, don't you? And I said, yeah, I do. I mean, actuarial tables would tend to predict that. And she said, have you begun to pray about you actually seeing me home? That one of your last acts of courage and honor would be to see me home. It was disruptive.
Oh my goodness.
At that level of going, I can't predict and I can't control, but I can pray that I have the honor and the heartache to see my wife depart this earth first. So
we're terrified of that. We don't want that to happen. We love our spouse.
Everything in me is, shall we use the word, repulsed at the thought until I begin to go, I would give my life if someone were to attack her. I would stand in the way. Why wouldn't I then ask Jesus for the privilege of, in one sense, protecting her in doing so?
In the last hours. Yeah.
So all to again say, every marriage is this tapestry that reveals something of the naughty back, but also the glorious front. And holding both and being able to see both is, again, where it increases both our wonder at being loved by God, but also the dependency to take in even more what the Spirit offers of the presence of Jesus.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to say two or three things in closing. Number one, I'm deeply impressed with the theological label for it is progressive sanctification, that you can have a conflict about a baked potato and only need 5 minutes off. I think a lot of people, and I would put myself in that camp, might need an hour and a half after having a conversation about potatoes. So progressive sanctification, putting in the work, that's one. Very tenderly, I would like to tell you that one time, not too long ago, I went to my doctor and he, did blood work and listened to my heart and lungs. He said, I don't know if it's good news or bad news, but you better prepare to live to be 100 because you're the kind of person that lives to be 100. And I said, honey, when I got home, I said, honey, you need to sit down. I got to tell you something. You're going to have to live to be 98 because she's 2 years younger than me. And if I'm living to 100, you got to live to be 98. So take care of yourself, sweetie, because I don't want to live without you. And I'm sure that's how we both feel, but we have to face harder things than that. The last thing I'm going to say is Dan Allender's a really good writer. He's a great conversation partner. Thank you so much for your candor and your honesty in this conversation, which is consistent with your candor, which is amazing candor in your books. And if anybody is looking for a little bit of help with a past trauma, small T or large, wounded heart to be told, Cry of the Soul, really good resources. I recommend as sharply as I can. You can actually get those books at a discount from our website, but you can also get them from Amazon, other places. We do link to our authors. And not only this book, but also Intimate Allies, two really fine books about marriage. Thanks for your time and for your decades of service.
Thank you, Dan. And always, always a delight to be with you.
Hello, everyone. Dan Allender and I kept talking after our interview formally ended. And as we chatted, I realized that I'd forgotten to ask him a question that was important to me. And that is, in the book, he compares falling in love to being high on cocaine. And we discussed why that matters. I hope you enjoy this bonus content or outtake, whatever you wish to call it. We didn't talk about that. Oh, getting married, falling in love is like being on cocaine. Come on, say a few words. We'll splice it in. Dan, why on earth do you say it jumped off the page? Falling in love is like being on cocaine because it gives you a dopamine hit, oxytocin, and adrenaline. And that's God's way of getting us to bond with somebody enough that we can then begin to learn how to actually love them.
Without biochemicals, I think most of us had enough sense to know this will ruin our lives. But when you've got dopamine flowing through that really is literally equivalent to cocaine.
Yeah, it's the same kind of physiological chemical. Go ahead.
Not shuts down, but it lowers
diminishes
your left frontal lobe processes, particularly Broca's area that manages language. So you are stultified in a kind of state of love where you're beginning to go, all the qualities that disturb you, you don't even see anymore. So you get biochemically suckered into love in order for the maturing process to eventually begin to occur, because research indicates that almost by 14 to 18 months,
it's going to be gone.
It's back to, shall we say, the normal processes of dopamine and oxytocin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So why are you sniffing your nose like that? I mean, I've always sniffed my nose like that. What are you talking about? No, you didn't.
You didn't have eyes to see it because you were stoned. And I thank God. This is not a fault. This is, again, the proclivity of God's playfulness, his willingness to let us both follow desire and yet knowing at the core, the deepest desire we have is to be like Jesus.
Working with Dan Doriani is a production of the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. We seek to promote faithfulness in the workplace, in education, in discipleship, and in the stories of believers who've applied their faith at work. If you want to put your faith to work and change your corner of the world, visit our website, the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. Look for faithandworkstl.org. That's one word. We'll help you start a cohort with like-minded believers who also want to practice their faith at work. This podcast is donor-supported. To keep us going, please donate on our website. Maybe more importantly, you can support us by listening, by subscribing, by sharing, by liking us, by posting us on your favorite platform, or go old school and tell a friend.